Welcome to the Gain Momentum podcast, focusing on timeless lessons from senior leaders in hospitality, technology, food service, and travel. I'm your host, Adam Mogelonsky, and today we have two guests, two brothers, Ken and Mark Heymann, who are the founders of Unifocus and their current venture, Heymann2 Associates. Ken and Mark, how are you doing?
Good, thank you.
Well, thank you. Very nice to be with you this afternoon.
Well, great to have you here. And, it's such a rarity that I get to interview two people at the same time and two brothers as well. So what I'm hoping to do is, before we dive into our first key question that we ask all guests, I'm hoping that each one of you could take a turn to describe what you're currently working on. And perhaps, Ken, I'll put it over to you first to describe that, but also give us a little background on Unifocus and your tenure there founding it with your brother.
Well, as you just pointed out, we founded Unifocus in 1998, and the origin of that company was a consulting practice that we had started about 15 years earlier. Mark had been working with staff planning, workforce management consulting firm, had an opportunity to focus on the hotel market, did so. He started a company which I joined a few years after that company was founded. We then started our own consulting practice, but our goal from the inception of that business was to build technology to do what we had been doing back in the time with paper, pencil, and pocket calculators. And that's what led to Unifocus's creation in 1998. And of course, over the years, we'd gone from some very, very early versions of workforce technology and labor management to where Unifocus is today, is certainly still one of the premier providers of workforce management technology, of course, the hotel industry. So I was sort of the latecomer to the process. Mark had been in the business and had founded a company, and then he and I together started what ultimately became Unifocus. As to today, we sold a majority stake in Unifocus to private equity. In turn, we stayed on for different lengths of time, depending upon the agreement. Once I had left, because I stayed longer, Mark and I again sort of got together, as we have for the better part of our lives. We've worked together for, 40 years now, and started Heymann2 Associates. And I'll let Mark talk about, his background a little bit and his focus. We sort of have two areas of focus. My focus is what I call the consulting practice, which basically involves working with hotels and owners to look for and define improvement opportunities throughout an operational assessment, and frequently working with the hotel management company to find opportunities for improvement. I have a staff of several people. We currently work at a few hotels, predominantly the auspices of an owner. In this particular case, we work with both owners and managers. Recently did some work for one of the companies that uses Unifocus technology to help them understand opportunities to use it more effectively, which is still a fundamental part of my practice, to help organizations use whatever labor management technology they have more effectively. And as I think anybody who's on this call or on this podcast would know, there's a number of applications out on the market today. And so we are somewhat software agnostic in terms of looking at ways to utilize the technology more effectively, and then also doing some consulting in some instances with private equity, looking to acquire workforce management technologies, things of that nature. So that's where the consulting practice focus has been since the inception of Heymann2, or H2A, as we like to call it, earlier this year. And I'll let Mark talk to the area where his focus is in terms of his activities.
Well, as Ken said, sold the business to private equity. I left about a month after that. We remain members of the board of directors. But since leaving Unifocus on a full-time basis, I've gotten myself involved in working with a charity for the treasurer, the charity in Dallas, that helps place veterans and disabled people back in the marketplace, which has been quite rewarding and happily quite successful. At the same time, I crunch the numbers with Ken in the H2A business, so I get to keep some of the books, etc. And then I've also started a new software company. We're in the middle of developing some new technology pretty much around the area of enhancing employee engagement and finding more goals, more ability, more capabilities to help the employee and the managerial team of any service business become more engaged with what they're doing and create a more effective reward process for those individuals. That's kind of, I think, where we sit around. I also, since leaving Unifocus, I've also acquired some real estate assets in some different parts of the country with a partner of mine.
Awesome. So thank you so much for the intro. Let's get into our first question. Then we can, of course, incorporate what you've just said into any sort of follow up. So, Mark and Ken, when it comes to scaling a business, what is the single piece of advice you would give entrepreneurs from your perspective as professionals in the hotel technology industry? I guess, Ken, if you wanted to go first, then we can go back to Mark. Or if Mark, you wanted to go first, your call.
Well, a couple of thoughts. One of the things I always talk about when I talk to people who are starting businesses, and I've had an opportunity to have conversations of this nature with various people, is to explain that when you're in a startup environment, your profit and loss statement is not as important as your cash flow. That you may be making a lot of money, but if people aren't paying the bills, so that's point one. And that sounds incredibly mundane. And yet a lot of companies I've seen fail because they're not looking at that. The other thing I would say, which is something Mark talks about, and also to segue this to him, is don't bite off more than you can chew. When we started our company, we had grand plans. We had a good mix between, Mark and I talk about this all the time. I think one of Mark's great virtues in our organization over the years has been his ability to drive forward with a vision of where the technology should go and always pushing that envelope as much as possible. Whereas I often wanted to make sure that we didn't bite off more than we could chew, that we had the resources, the skills, the ability to get where we wanted to go. And oddly enough, that kind of push-pull of like, yeah, we have to go there, but how fast can we go there? So some of it almost sounds a bit cliched. You need a coherent plan that you can test yourself against frequently so that when it comes to scaling and you're talking about growth, to use again a cliche, you want to prepare, you want to hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. So I would turn that over to Mark. But those are the things that always stick out to me, like understanding the essence of managing the financial aspect of the business. And then also making sure that what you aspire to achieve is really viable based on the resources and the skills within your organization. And understanding that as you grow, the skills you need vary. When you're a little company, there's real value in having someone who might be a jack of all trades. Can do a little of this, a little of that. But as you grow, you get a little more specialized. And I think Mark would agree that when we look back over the years of Unifocus in our early days, we ultimately had to move on from some people who were great jacks of all trades, but didn't experience or present the level of expertise we needed in areas as we grew the business.
Yeah, I think coupled with that, I mean, Ken's comment, on don't count your chickens before they're hatched. I think you've got to be very careful of how you scale, the speed of which you scale. And it's a delicate balancing act because you want to be prepared to handle more business. At the same time, as Ken said, you can't hire an abnormal number of people in the hopes that you're going to close 5 more contracts. So it's a delicate balancing act between hiring more people, getting more capabilities. And the other thing I think that's critical in looking at from a scaling standpoint is one of the challenges that companies frequently run into is if they scale too quickly, they can see a deterioration in their product quality. And especially when you're a small business, if you're a big mega company who you kick the bucket once or twice, you can probably survive that. If you're a small company in a startup world and you're trying to grow the business and you've got 10 clients, if you will, and 2 or 3 of them have a poor experience, you've now pretty much put yourself in a situation where you may be in danger of the entire business. So you've got to balance your growth, your scaling, with ensuring that you're still delivering on your value proposition, and that every customer of yours, every relationship you establish as you grow the business needs to be at the exact same quality level. Earlier on in our business, we had a few very large clients. And as we would talk to even a smaller client about our capabilities, one of the key questions they asked was, you've got this client and this client. Are you going to pay as much attention to me because I'm much smaller than some of your other clients or people you've been working with for years? And you have to have the internal capabilities, but also the commitment that regardless of size, every one of your clients gets treated with the utmost of care and that the value proposition you're committed to is absolutely delivered. In the vein that Ken was talking about is you've got to watch your cash flow. You know, the other comment I would have in a scaling, pure scaling, is in the beginning stages of your organization, you don't necessarily need to do it all in-house. One of the mistakes we made very early on with one of our developers was he felt we had to develop a new GUI for our clients and spent massive amounts of time and energy. And the truth of the matter was there was a product on the market that met 85% of our needs. So the other balancing point with your scale is only move to internalizing something that's critical to your business at a point in time. Make sure you're looking outside so that you can flex your costs until you get to a point where you can actually take it fully in-house. And I think it's great to say that we'd like to do it all in-house, but there's some great systems, great technologies. Unifocus at 1.5 to do their own reporting and finally turn to some reporting tools in the market that may not have met every aspect of what we're looking to do, but were more than sufficient to meet our client goals. So that's another key issue of scaling is can you buy it at a house for a while until you realize that the amount you're spending on, let's say, a monthly basis exceeds what you can take it in-house for.
But I think it also goes, I mean, it goes back to Mark's earlier comment about it really comes down to what is your value proposition and what are people buying your technology for? So to really understand what is the absolute essence of your technology and what you need to develop and what you need to own versus what you can buy from a third party that, as Mark said, may not be the perfect solution, but it's more than sufficient to meet your client goals and doesn't, I can't think of the word I'm looking for, but doesn't diminish your focus on your core product and your core value proposition.
And I would add your core expertise. There was a hotel company years ago that'll go unnamed, but they actually investigated outsourcing all their housekeeping operations and felt that their core capability was marketing. Well, as it turned out, they had some errors or mistakes in their assessment. But the fact was that we're looking at their core competency and we're looking at making a decision. Do we need to keep this in-house or is it something that we can actually outsource and it'll be more profitable for us? So I think those are the decisions that you scale. We need to also take a look at internal skills and strengths and also what you can buy in the market until it makes sense before you internalize.
Well, both of you have mentioned the term cash flow. And this, of course, we're talking right now about internalizing your core strengths, which implies that you're externalizing some other non-strengths or non-immediate strengths, and that may in turn save you costs to then trim down how much the money is flowing out of your business. My question to you is, and when it comes to cash flow and accounts receivable, what's a polite way to tell people, hey, pay your bills net 30 instead of letting clients go net 90, net 120, and them just promising that it's coming, and then you're slowly hemorrhaging because you're a zero interest bank? How do you solve that?
It's an interesting question because the simple reality is in some parts of the market, you're paid on a very regular basis. You have a good relationship. They have an accounts payable group that gets your bill, you get your payments on a regular basis. And then throughout the years, we've had clients delayed. In fact, unfortunately, can lose some clients over it. And the balance point is You can't afford to let them go 120, 150 days, especially in a small organization where you're actually dependent upon cash flow. I think part of it comes down to frequently people call the accounting department and think they're going to get paid through the accounting department. I think the key is when someone starts falling behind, you got to call the person that signed the contract. You have to basically get a hold of that person and, at least in our minds, or surely in my mind, say, look, this just isn't fair. You agreed to do this. We're delivering on the service. We've accomplished everything. Here are the reports. And we're having a hard time understanding why you're not paying us on time. If there's a problem with the service, we're happy to address it. But I think at times, and I think one of the challenges the world has today is people think because they sent an email, they've done as much as they can to get something resolved. There is a point where you literally have to pick up the phone, talk to the person who signed the agreement, and try to get an understanding of why are we not getting paid? What is the challenge? And then look, they may be having some financial challenges, and then you try to work out either a payment schedule, and the last resort is, which is unfortunate, is you stop delivering services. The reality is, as soon as you do that, you may well have lost a client.
But we did have a structured escalation protocol, just to elaborate a little bit further. So our protocol was, in the first 30 days, 45 days, and all candor, Adam, to your point, we never hocked somebody to collect if it was within 30 days. Just everybody ages you. So you have to build, a model that accommodates the fact that if you send a bill Tuesday, you ain't getting paid Friday. And if you're not doing that, if you're not acknowledging that a bill that goes out Tuesday isn't going to be paid until the next month, then you're fooling yourself. So there's that financial planning piece of the process. But from the escalation protocol, within the first, call it 31 to 60 days, AR pursued it. The next step up was the client success manager or the customer success manager, whatever term the individual responsible for that. And that reach was typically, at least to the senior person in finance in the other company, we no longer wanted to talk to AR. And then to Mark's point, the third escalation point, and Mark makes two incredibly valuable points, okay? At a certain point, stop sending emails. They don't work. People can ignore emails. People are more inclined to take phone calls. And then secondarily, and this was something that we would discuss, I would say to people, look, at a certain point in time, the call has to come from me because I'm the COO. So I'm going to call my counterpart or whomever is a contract signer and say, why aren't you paying us? And that's a different conversation from a client success manager or an AR manager. So the second point is you need a coherent escalation process that everybody abides by. Because to the point when we were selling software as a license, it was much harder to collect. Mark's right. At some point with software, with SaaS models, which is where everybody is, you can always turn it off, but then you're going to lose them. But you got to have a coherent escalation process in place that allows you, because I would sometimes say to people within my organization, I'd look and sometimes I was behind, I'd say, wait a minute, this is 120 days past due. What's going on here? And they would say they hadn't responded. And my response would be, why the heck didn't you come to me? Because I'll make that phone call. And if you're an executive at any level in an organization, you have to be willing to make that phone call and have that conversation Mark is talking about.
I think also, as Ken talks about, is the escalation. There's a point, if you look at the average accounting or financial person, one of the metrics they have is pennies outseen around an account. So you also have to make sure that in your organization, it's not punitive if those days begin to extend. And some people will just hide the information from you. You have to have a financial person, and as a company grows, you go from a bookkeeper to a controller to a CFO, but you have to have regular reviews as executives of the company of your financial wherewithal. As Ken commented earlier, what's not just your cash position, or what's your next 90 days of cash flow. So we have to manage the process as much as you have escalation to talk to the client or why you're not getting paid. You have to have a process in place that ensures that people understand this is one of the key lifeblood of the company. And as a team, we're all here to help make sure that we get paid on time, that it's not only falling on your shoulders, and therefore you don't want to be as candid as you want to be. So it's also, I think, part of it is how do you manage the process with an open and fair culture so everyone recognizes and said, the escalation at some point, you may bring a salesperson into the conversation and say, look, Sam or Sarah, so and so, way behind you. Has there been turnover? Do you know anything about the client that's causing this? Or maybe you all need to go involved in making a phone call. Because this can come in a very early part of our discussion today. Ca- Cash flow is the lifeblood of any company, and it is surely critical from the start in the startup world. So you have to be prepared to, as I said, pick up the phone and make sure your whole organization knows that everyone's responsible. Even the person that's taking service calls, if there's a problem, if that service call isn't going well, and that potentially becomes a reason why the client may say, well, we haven't paid you because we're handling a couple of service issues. I would also suggest that before you pick up the phone to talk to the top client, you make sure you talk to the service team in your organization to make sure internally you're not missing anything that would give the client a rationale for not paying.
Yeah, that's a great point. You should, and we all know this at the 30,000 foot level. As a senior executive, you should never make a call that puts you at risk of being blindsided. And Mark's right. You have to do your homework and make sure that they don't have a reason to say, well, we haven't paid you because of something or other, which may be minor in the grand scheme of the things, but certainly I've had experience. And again, we've lost Mark, hopefully momentarily, where people have said, well, we haven't paid the bill yet because we had this one problem with this one manager and it's not been resolved yet.
So we're diving into our second question here. Ken and Mark, what are some of the common pitfalls or failures you have witnessed that business owners should look to avoid when scaling their business?
So just to finish off, the point Mark was making, because it's happened to me a few times, went through the escalation process, call somebody, and they have some rationale as to why they haven't paid us that they feel is justified. And because I didn't do my homework and find out where exactly we were with that client, I was caught off guard. Certainly happened to me a couple of times. So my advice is before you call someone, in a collection mode, make sure you are fully attuned to what's going on with that client and any issues they have in their resolution. And then, to segue into pitfalls, I guess, because in growing a business, I could recount, as Mark could, several strategic decisions we made that were essential. The company is old enough so that it was back in the late 90s, early aughts, that people were still, sending computer disks for people to use software programs. And so one of the big conversations at the time was, should we stop? Should we rewrite the application and move it to the web? Well, obviously we made that decision, or we wouldn't be on this call today because we'd gone out of business. Then there were other decisions we made that didn't pan out so well. So what I would say at a broad level is two things. One, really understanding the decision-making process within your organization. Because in my experience, people frequently don't understand the decision-making process, which is to say that there are people from whom you gather information who think that because they are information providers, they should be part of the decision. They're not. You need to know who's going to be the essential decision makers. And two, and I think this was one of our strengths as an organization, we were flat out open to conflict and disagreement. I think what drove us, and Mark has heard this from me for many years, we had a third senior partner who was our CIO, and whenever there was a dispute, and there were many, at the strategic level, we believed that if there was an argument for A and B, to use a hypothetical, and Mark's position was A and my position was B, and I'm just going to exclude our third partner for the moment. If we went with B, because I had sort of, had a good argument and it failed, then it means that Mark hadn't figured out a way to counter the argument. The reverse was also true. If I argued for B and we went with A, And that failed because Mark, as CEO, got to make that final decision. And that's part of the understanding that someone has to be able to, if you can't reach consensus, someone has to be willing to make a final decision. And we've both seen companies get paralyzed because they don't come to a decision. And sometimes in technology, especially, you have to move forward. But if A was the wrong decision, we always owned it. Whatever decision we made, good or bad, we all owned it. And so one of the pitfalls that companies make is they fall victim to groupthink, right? Which is, well, it sounds like a good idea, so we should do that, when someone in the room is saying, no, this is not a good idea. And that person is hesitant to stand up and assert her perspective that it's not a good idea. So to me, it's all about having a good, solid decision-making process where you're open, candid, willing to engage in some conflict and disagreement, but also respect who the final decision maker is and how you get to a final decision. Mark and I could recount a half a dozen major errors that we felt we made, but we survived them, you know? So that's really how I think about pitfalls in growing a business, because you make important strategic decisions and you better make good ones more than you make bad ones.
But in reality, they were just rehashing of our operations meetings. Look for is, when do you bring in outside advisors to help you think differently about your business? Or it's very easy to become so enmeshed in your day-to-day business that while you think you're just talking about the day-to-day business, and it makes it at times more difficult to think strategically, where you bring in some outside directors, which we did early on, especially with Unifocus, but we had some even with the company before Unifocus. One of the key things that those outside directors forced us to do was to think differently about the business. One of the key questions I would frequently ask our team throughout the year, not every week, but a few times a year, was what would, if we bought this business yesterday, what would we be doing tomorrow? And you have to force yourself to think. I hate to use this cliche, but I'm going to. Just to think differently about your business. You are so enmeshed every day in the day-to-day commentary or the day-to-day feedback that you have to step outside the box. And I think that's critical for scaling, for truly growing a business. And the other thing I think that's critical, and we've had some challenges with it, is, are you really prepared to measure your customer satisfaction? Or are you afraid of the measurement? We implemented a long time ago regular customer feedback, formalized surveys. And without it, and as companies I consult with today, without that feedback, you can be living in a delusion. You're not really aware. So if you're excellent service for really growing a business from a positive standpoint, there was a large hotel company years ago. We talked about doing an employee ownership survey. And their answer was, no, we're not going to do it. To which we said, why? And the answer was, well, because we don't do anything with the survey results. To which our response was, so you're basically prepared to sit in the dark, not knowing what your employees think at all. Even though a lot of the feedback you can react to. And I think part of scaling, part of growing the business is making sure that client relationship you have, you're monitoring on a very close basis, and that you're getting outside input into how to grow the business and how to strategically think. We brought a accounting person on our board how many years ago, but the gentleman could think differently about our business. And I think those are some aspects that small companies either are unwilling to do or they're afraid to do it because they don't want to see the result.
Well, the other thing that Mark's comment reminds me of is we also always did an annual employee opinion survey. And I'd love to say everybody loved us. They thought we were the best bosses in the world and we were wonderful human beings, and this, they couldn't find a better place to work. But the truth is that's never entirely the case. Some of it's personality, some of it's style. Every organization has a culture. Some people really fit in that culture. Some people don't. I used to say that clearly ours was a culture where you were better off asking forgiveness than permission. And that sounds like a cliche, which I will grant you, yet at the same time, there are people you would hire who really didn't want to take that risk. They wanted to ask permission. And other people, they felt the work was too difficult. There are lots of reasons why people aren't happy in their job. And you have to listen to that feedback thoughtfully. You have to be willing to you have to be willing to respond to the valid feedback. Some of the feedback you get is frustration. You can toss that aside. But, if several employees all tell you that you need to work on the same flaw, you have an obligation to the business, not just to the employees, to address those flaws and improve upon them. And so as much as outside feedback is important and customer feedback is important, employee feedback is just as important too, because I used to jokingly say, and this is going to sound terrible, we get our feedback from employees, and sometimes people would say, kind of mean things. I only had one question. I don't care who wrote it. It doesn't matter. Okay. What matters is, do you think it's legitimate? If it's legitimate, do something about it.
Building on your previous point, going back to the whole idea of the escalation process for cash flow. And now I want to touch on developing a process for quality feedback, because I love the idea of getting thoughtful feedback and really being thoughtful about it. And a lot of times the best way to do that is one-on-one interviews, but that isn't necessarily scalable to do across all stakeholders. So what was the process that you both developed at Unifocus to get quality feedback that you as executives could use thoughtfully, while at the same time streamlining that around something that is scalable, like a survey or some other mechanism where the quality might be sacrificed because it's putting everything into A, B, C, D, and E, so to speak?
I think there are really three pieces of the process for us. One, as we've already said, we did an annual customer survey, and that was sent to everybody who used the software. Whether it was a head of department or GM, and we promoted feedback from all of our clients. That was one part of the process. Another part was a set of quarterly meetings, that we invited. With a lot of our major accounts, you had either some sort of team at corporate or senior person in the organization was responsible as the liaison to Unifocus. And we'd invite all those people to a quarterly meeting. And that meeting was multi-purpose. Some of it was just show and tell. Here's what we're working on. Here's what, we think the next generation should look like. What do you guys think? What kind of feedback can we get? Those were quarterly. And then we had an annual, this is interesting. We had what we called an annual client meeting, not a user conference. But again, once a year, we would ask, to just use one example, one of Unifocus' clients is Lowe's Hotels. And so their senior labor manager and typically one or two other folks in his group would come down to this meeting. We'd hold it in Dallas. It would be 2 days. We would go through all of our development plans. We would go through all of our sort of brainstorming with them, like, what are you guys looking for? What can we do? And then we would also have sessions with them on, how they use the software, how people could use it more effectively. And that was great because not only did it let us talk to our clients, but over the years, you'd have the senior labor executive from company A and the senior labor executive from company B, and they got to know each other. And they had a dialogue about how their companies use, the technology. So all three of those. And the fourth thing, which is at least one of my responsibilities as COO, focusing more on external relationships, was to go visit our clients, like get out there and talk to them, like not do a phone call. COVID made that pretty difficult. But, if the client's headquarters were in Chicago, I would try to go to Chicago at least once a year and meet with them face to face. So really, as I think about it, there were four pieces: the survey, the quarterly meetings, the annual conference. And I can't say I visited every client. Thankfully, the business grew to a point where that was problematic. But I visited all the major clients, fairly regularly and stayed in touch with them. And Mark even, again, certain major key clients, Mark made a point of engaging with them several times a year.
Yeah, I think the last aspect on it is don't write your own survey. Have a professional write the survey. I've seen organizations put surveys together and they get the answers they're looking for. And I think the key thing, if you're really going to do a survey, it's got to be objectively put together. We've had people from Penn State University. We've had people with PhDs, people in psychometrics, all help us making sure the surveys that we produce and then delivered were well thought through, well thought out, and actually gave candid, actionable feedback. I had a company I invested in about a year ago, told me to do an employee survey, had their marketing person put it together, and they got the exact results the CEO wanted to get. Not that they were candid, but they were the exact results the CEO wanted. Therefore, everything was fine and hunky-dory. And reality, if you are doing a survey, that it's put together so that you're getting a solid, candid response, not just what you want to hear. Because it's too easy to hear what you want to hear and then do nothing.
Yeah, there's a lot of expressions around that. And I just finished reading another book talking about how businesses worked in Soviet Russia. And it was pretty much everyone was so afraid of their bosses that when the boss said to do something, they would do it. And when the boss asked for the feedback, it was, give them the feedback they want to hear, or else, there's going to be consequences, right? So it's, if people aren't given a proper medium, or are too afraid to voice their opinion, you're going to get exactly what you're asking, and that isn't going to allow you to grow organically, to really know what the issue is, or how to grow.
It's a bit of a cliche, but to your point, if part of personal growth is looking at yourself candidly, same is true for business growth. I mean, none of us are good at everything, regardless of what we may think. So you better be candid about what you need to get better at, and you better be candid about what your weaknesses are, because Mark and I won't go down this particular conversation, we happen to share certain characteristics across a set of psychological profiles that we've historically used, to help develop and grow people. Well, I can look at those and say, well, we share these characteristics, which is why we've been able to work very successfully together all these years. But it also says that we need people with these other characteristics to help the business too, because those are characteristics that we lack.
Ken and Mark, final question. What advice would you give for founding a company with an immediate family member?
I think you got to come to the conclusion, why are you doing it? Are you doing it because the other family member doesn't have a job, and therefore you're giving the person a job, right? Or you feel a responsibility to take care of the other family member? Not a good reason. Ken and I got into business and been in business. We've been in business together for 42 years or so. And we've been able to, and honestly say, succeed in that process, because Ken has a skill set that I don't have. I have some skills. I hope that he doesn't have that complementary, but we're not here while we do take care of each other. We didn't start the business because we're looking to take care of each other. When Ken first joined the organization, I hired him in another company that I was an owner of, because I felt there was a shortcoming in the industry that Ken could fulfill. And then the business evolved from there. But I do know a lot of people who get into business with a family member, they don't complement each other. It's maybe for the wrong reason. So I would just caution that when you make a decision, the position that Ken got originally hired for in this company that I was an owner of was because he had a skill set that I was absolutely convinced the company could use to magnify its growth, not because he needed a job, because I knew Ken could get a job in a multitude of other places. And then the business evolved from there. So if you do it because you're carrying the other person, or whatever term you want to use, I don't believe you'll be successful in the long term.
I think the other thing that I always said, and I've said this to people before, is as much as we're brothers, and to Mark's point, I think we had some different skill sets, we also respected the business relationship. Mark was the CEO, I was the COO. Fair to say I was typically the last person to argue for a point if there was a conversation. But I also respected that the ultimate decision was Mark's, because he was the CEO, and because I was his brother, didn't mean that he had to do what I wanted to do out of any brotherly relationship. So in terms of how we operated, while certainly, everybody knew we were brothers, when I left Unifocus, we had about 200 employees, so it wasn't that huge a company. But I always respected the fact that once we made a decision and once Mark made a decision, that I was going to support that and I was not going to undercut him, and then the other thing is, and this is what I said before, we never spent a lot of time looking back at the mistakes we made. You can spend a lot of time blaming each other, but we always had the joint ability to look forward. If anything, we would joke about things we screwed up, and we screwed things up. Everybody does, But I think the key is to respect that it's also a business relationship. It's not just a family relationship, and you have to keep that in mind if you're going to be in business with a relative.
I think we've been able to span this 40 plus years. We have very aligned vision of not just where the company could go, but the value structure we wanted the company to represent and the culture we wanted to drive the company with. Everyone talks about open door culture, or whatever, and I'm probably of the two of us far more volatile at times over issues, maybe more passionate or show more passion at times. But at the end of the day, when you're in business with, and this goes for whether it's a relative or anybody, if you don't share values, if you don't view the world through roughly like perspectives, the conflicts that'll be created will make the business not as successful as it could be, and can lead to certain exchanges that actually diminish the capabilities of the business. And I think, as Ken said, we'd fight about, if that's the right word, argue about stuff, make some good, make some bad decisions. But the one thing we did was we left it all on the table. And then when a decision got made, and we were all abiding by our best efforts to be successful with it.
The reason I'm chuckling is because I would say to people, look, you need to understand, Mark and I will argue at 10 a.m. in executive committee and be really annoyed at each other. And then at noon, we're figuring out where we want to go to lunch.
Yeah. But that's the best way. And I come from a family business as well. I do work with my father, and, behind the scenes, it's, F this, F you, F that. And I'm just being honest here, deciding where to go. And then at the end, it's like, okay, so when are you coming over for Shabbos? Right? So, but that's families, right?
That's exactly true.
Yeah. So on that note, Ken and Mark, thank you so much for coming on. I know you went out of your way to make time today. Thank you both. And it's been a delightful conversation. These are foundational lessons for any business. Thank you both.
Thanks for listening to the Gain Momentum podcast. To stay up to date, make sure to follow or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Gain Advisors, head to gainadvisors.com.